Southwest 2018. Just as awesome. I'm just gonna do like the really quick intro thing here because there's nothing more fun in panels than hearing people introduce themselves, clearly. Let's just start right here. In like 5 seconds, tell us who you are.
Josephine Goub, CEO of TechFugees.
Great.
Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation and the Oslo Freedom Forum.
Alex Corrin, co-founder and Chief Innovation Officer at Wombi.
Eugene Leventhal, CEO and founder of EduDAO and a grad student at CMU right now.
And if you guys forget, we're in order, apparently, up there, so this is really easy. So this panel is called Technology and the Human Condition, and that can mean a lot of things. So I want to hear, like, let's just go down just quickly. When you hear those words, what comes to mind? Like, what is the first thing that bubbles up when you hear technology and the human condition?
Philosophy, French philosophy. No, but seriously.
Yeah.
To me, it's like the ability of governments to control you using technology, or the ability of people to liberate themselves with technology.
I definitely think of both ends of the spectrums. One end is it's really not good and we have to be very careful, and then the other end is we have infinite possibilities.
I guess for me, the idea that comes up is, I call it being human in the 21st century, the idea that we still haven't fully understood on a psychological and neurological basis how we function, yet tech is changing everything around us. So how do we kind of manage, all of this change while we're, building the plane while flying kind of analogy.
Let's dig into that. But first I want to say, like, if you guys have any thoughts from the audience, scream them out. We're loose here. We're all friends. Don't wait till the end. Just like raise your hand or throw it out. We're going to make this as interactive as we can. But let's dig into what you're just saying there. I think that's like a really interesting say, because it's true. Like, evolution moves glacially, super slow. Technology moves super, super fast. And we are, like to say, like, we are in many ways aliens. We were, most of our evolution was in a planet that doesn't exist, a world that doesn't exist. And it's gotten so fast now we're, a generation apart, people don't recognize the world they live in. I want you guys to kind of talk about, like, what does this mean, though, from a practical standpoint, especially when it comes to people feeling maybe like they're being left behind? Because technology clearly has so much promise, can do so much. And I think, but when people see it happen and benefit people who aren't them, it clearly creates a psychological condition. Have you guys seen any of this in your work, or seen people somewhat resentful about technology because they feel like it doesn't help them when it's helping other people?
Sure, happy to jump in with that. I mean, I know just looking in sort of on the education space, I'll just take that as a specific example. And coming from New York, we were really focusing on the Bronx, which for those who aren't from New York, it's from a resource standpoint, it's probably the most neglected of the 5 boroughs. And there's a lot of other history that goes into that kind of complicates things. But I know there were 2 sides there. So going into the schools, they're like, oh, okay, well, you don't look like you're from this borough, and you're not from this borough, and why are you here? And a bunch of people have come here and tried to help us, and you don't get our problems because you're not from here, so you're not going to get it. You're just going to come here, try to fix something, and leave as soon as it's possible. And it was a very interesting, jaded perspective, which I wasn't aware of because I hadn't been promised falsely, the same exact thing for over 30, 40 years. So there's, I feel like, a certain emotional hurdle that ends up coming up. And the other side is in tech and education with any ed tech solutions. Like, in talking to most teachers, they're like, yeah, I love the idea of technology, except the first one that came to me happened to be not the best product. That didn't go well. I don't have time to do this. So how do you, even for those who want it, how do you reduce the barriers to entry so they can actually get access to it and play around with it easily?
And I think what this brings to mind is sort of one of the problems that has long suffered with technological solutions to world problems, that oftentimes are made by people who have very little experience with the problem they're trying to solve. They come from an academic perspective or a classroom perspective, and when you actually go to the school in the Bronx, you kind of have a rude awakening when people realize, no, that's not really how we do things here. In your guys' experiences, particularly Josephine, you're dealing with refugees. People have all sorts of ideas for how to help refugees, but have never dealt with a refugee. What are some of the rude awakenings and surprises they have when they actually try to solve these problems and then get down onto the floor?
That's a really good question about, like, the problem statement, because we've seen this with TechFugees, growing hackathons and events, bringing technologists, trying to solve the problems of refugees and NGOs, and having a lot of people come with their idea of what is a refugee and what is their problem. And then we had to absolutely bring the refugees in, bring them a voice, and have them actually design the hackathon. So people would understand that it's not about so much giving them access to an Airbnb model for shelter. It's actually giving them a space where they're feeling welcomed. And that was not getting through. People thought, oh no, but I'll give them, we'll create a platform. It's like an Airbnb. The refugee will get 6 months in my house and it will be sorted. We're sorting their situation. And the refugee was expressing, no, I want to feel welcomed. I don't want to live in an Airbnb or leave someone's house. And then the failure of that product was that we didn't engage with the people that were receiving the refugees in their homes. And so after 6 months, they were like, well, the refugee's been here for 6 months, and I'm not going to kick them out. So it was coming from good intentions, trying to apply what we know in technology of product, Airbnb, and then apply it to the situation of refugees, being like, oh, they don't have a house, so we'll put an Airbnb for them. It doesn't work like this. So the topic technology and human conditions, you really need to go into what is the real challenge and what is the human condition you're trying to tackle and trying to alleviate, and listen before you build anything. Because I think there's too much solutionism. Like, we've got a great app, let's put it there and it works. And it might make people more vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, I see the opposite in the human rights space, which is where I'm from, where you see actually like a general, I wouldn't say ignorance, but lack of interest in this, what I would almost want to call, to be dramatic about it, like a new Cold War brewing, where on the one side you have the WeChat model, which is a government that has a technology that allows it to control more than 1 billion people on a micro aspect of everything that they do, whether it's messages to loved ones or what they're going to invest in or where they're going to go tomorrow. This is not the future. This has been going on for years. The world's largest government has this system. And on the other side, you have models like Bitcoin, where you have this like censorship-resistant way for us to transmit value. And then there's all kinds of fun stuff you can build on top of that. And I think, unfortunately, the human rights community, the people who usually speak out and pressure companies and governments to do good, are a little lost, including us, and like no one's really setting out a roadmap for how we can get involved and pressure people in the right direction. So building a moral compass for this new era would be very important, and that's what I think the folks here can really help with.
So I think one thing, takeaways from both you guys are saying is it's really important to make sure that sort of all of the stakeholders of a solution are kind of involved as early as possible, so people don't come in with assumptions that may not play out on the ground. And then I want to kind of tease out what you're saying a little bit, because I think this is a really big topic, and it's going to be a big topic over the next 100 years or so, which is, what happens when technologies that are maybe even developed with an idealist mind kind of get into the hands of people who have nefarious means or purposes or ideas about them. I mean, we can clearly see this with social media, which on paper should be this fantastic way to connect people, but is clearly used for nefarious purposes every single day. Blockchain, I don't think, has yet made it to the nefarious side for the most part, but how could it? Like, what should people be worried about? What should we be doing to protect this protocol and this technology from the early stages to make sure what happened to social media doesn't happen to blockchain?
I will just say I am not an expert on blockchain by any means. However, I can speak from the perspective of seeing many technologies fail. And I speak from healthcare, and I know that we all know healthcare is incredibly antiquated. It's the most antiquated system we've ever seen. And the reason is because everybody is coming up with these brilliant new ideas from the outside and then are bringing them in and then are selling them on the idea, and then it takes years to roll out a product, and then by the time it's rolled out, they're like, this doesn't work. So the real issue lies in the fact, exactly Josephine's point, it's coming to the center of the problem and working with the very people who need the solution and asking them, what is the solution for you? How does this really work? Let's play it out. Let's actually test how it's going to work in these markets on a small scale before making it that large. And I think blockchain is so incredibly powerful, but it really needs to come from the source and working with people who understand the problem, not just people who have really good ideas, because if we don't bridge that gap, we're never really gonna get anywhere.
Just to build in the health area, this paradigm that's developing of like centralized versus centralized, I think one of the problems we're going to face now and in the next few years is people taking advantage of individuals not understanding the qualities of the system. So in healthcare, you might have a hospital or a group of providers that build a private blockchain to record the data and the personal private medical records of the people in that system, all of their patients. And the patients might be sold a bill of goods that says this is going to make things more transparent and better for you, but they're not being told that there's still a centralized boss or admin that could modify those records, and they have every incentive to do so. So I think education about how these new structures are being built is very important.
Just to add on that, it's super important for the case of refugees. The main hurdle for refugees is to get their status, to get the protection, to get this refugee status. This is the state that gives it. And the potential of blockchain would be almost to remove the state administration to get that status. That person would be able to prove that, yes, they've been threatened of death. Yes, they had to flee away a country that from which government didn't want or couldn't protect them. And you would remove the whole state administration processing times, which can be 3 months, can be 4 years. And while the state is processing your application for a refugee, if it's 4 years, you're not allowed to work. So you're in limbo, and your life condition can be like, if you don't have money, really, you get what I mean. So the potential is huge. And if we do not look at using the blockchain with all its potential for the good, for the one that are in most needs of disruption today, I'm afraid that we're going to lose the battle of making the blockchain revolution, because we're going to get closed again in the hands of corporates, and they'll just make sure that they use it for their own interest, but not for the interest of the greater good, I guess.
And sorry if I could just quickly add to that. So I'm really big on the idea of the education, the open sourcing it, making things transparent as possible. But I also think, and I know in speaking to a lot of people, it seems as though it's assessing what's been done in the past or what's currently being done. And I don't think there's enough of the view that these models are, for the most part, unimagined still. We have never had the opportunity to do these things on this kind of level. We've never had this kind of tech. We've never been in this position before. So we shouldn't look backwards. We should try to take a step back and really think of how can we plan things for the future, irrespective of where we are, and then try to fit it into reality. And that's why I'm very excited to see the fact that there's more blockchain classes in philosophy departments at universities. And that was something I didn't realize before getting back to grad school, and I think that's awesome. That's a lot of ethical and very humanistic questions will come out of those discussions, which can then aid the tech and all the other components too.
This is super. So you guys all kind of come from slightly different fields, whether it's education or healthcare or dealing with refugees. Looking back at your spaces, what mistakes have you seen people attempting to solve the innate problems of your worlds? What mistakes have you seen them come across, and what lessons would you like the world to learn from their mistakes going forward when people try to tackle these big issues? Jump in.
Happy to jump in with that with education. I've talked to so many people who, I'm so passionate about this. I want to break the Department of Education. I want to reinvent everything and all these other things. And it's like, none of that's going to happen. You really got to calm down and think of what we can actually accomplish in the next year, right? It's great for when you have that kind of massive structure that's in the way of actually innovating. And the Department of Education is pretty big, yet they don't force curriculum. They don't really have any oversight over schools, really. They can convene schools. They don't dictate anything when the states specifically dictate things, but at least they have an innovation team. It's 4 people, but at least it's not nothing. So I don't know, that's one of the things that worries me there is, taking the entrepreneurial position, you're still going to have roadblocks getting into schools. Trying to break it from the policy perspective, good luck. Trying to actually create a new system and counteract the Department of Education, that's become very privileged. And the people who benefit from that are the people with a lot of money for the most part. So, how do you actually disrupt something? And that's where I'm excited in seeing more higher education institutions work with interesting global and national nonprofits and trying to think of what are the new ways that we can add programming, whether it's after school programming, potentially get some of that certified on blockchain so they can leverage that for employment later, and what are the new models that we can come up with without changing any of the existing pillars, because they're just going to take ages to fix in the coming years.
In the human rights field, I wouldn't say it's a mistake, but a lost opportunity was not pushing the idea that you could make investments and be profitable and make money and also support human rights at the same time. So other sectors did this really successfully. Obviously, you've heard of ed tech and health tech and clean tech, agri-tech, but there's no human rights tech or democracy tech. And I think part of that is justifiable. There wasn't really a field or an industry in the last decade that that would make sense for that. But all of a sudden, in the last few years, you have decentralized storage and communications and encrypted messaging, and you have ways for us to own our data, and you have ways for us to transact it with no one being able to stop us. And people are going to make a lot of money, have made a lot of money in this space, will make a lot of money in this space, and all of a sudden, I think the human rights community can start getting more involved with where investment is going, and really help build this decentralized future that you guys are promoting, which I think is cool.
Future is spread out. It's like butter. So let's just, I want you guys to kind of just chime in as free flow as you can with whatever is coming to mind right now. But let's talk a little bit about some of the ways. I think this is really interesting to kind of think about the ways technology, even like good-minded, idealist technologies, don't take into account the human condition, don't take into account the nuances of behavior, the nuances of what motivates people. In your spaces specifically, or in other things you guys have seen, what sort of hidden motivations have you seen in people who are involved, stakeholders on, either the people creating technologies or the supposed beneficiaries of technologies? What hidden motivations are you seeing that may not be obvious to people who are not deeply ingrained into your worlds that would be really important for anybody looking to innovate in your space?
Mazel tov.
Mazel tov. Is it party poppers? Yeah. No.
I can speak to that. So I think that one of the most critical things that's typically overlooked is having an engaged workforce across the board in all industries. And it's really because there's never really a personalized analytics to that person, right? You never really know how you're doing. It's always a general consensus. And so the problem is people don't really take responsibility for their actions, and they also don't really know when they're doing a good job to be motivated to continue to do that work. So when we talk about human behavior and the human condition, if we can basically capture real-time feedback on how each individual person is performing on an ongoing basis, and then empower individuals with their own analytics, they'll actually be able to improve their own behaviors. So they'll know, wow, I'm really good at respecting my clients, but when it comes to taking time to explain things, I'm not really good at that. Let me now be more mindful the next time I have a conversation with a client to be able to impact them in a way that's meaningful to them. So it's really being able to capture what's meaningful and then empower people, and then not use the punitive method of saying you're now going to be punished because you didn't do a good job, but instead recognize and reward people for doing the right thing.
I'll take one example of ways it could have been, ways it has been done better than what was initially planned. So someone one day came at a hackathon and they were like, well, you get the refugees in those camps. They want jobs. They're there for 17 years. Let's give them jobs with putting computers and then online, and they'll be able to earn revenue. But the thing is, it didn't work out well because he was thinking what they want is a job, and it's almost like recreating a sort of workforce that is really cheap, that stays in that camp, and you don't teach them anything, and they're going to do the mini small jobs, and they wanted them to do testing, user testing and stuff. Sure, you're going to learn stuff, but it's not what the refugees want. And I think it goes back to what we initially said, is refugees, when they say we want a job, they actually, for the ones that I met in Zeta, they want community, and they want to be able to expand. So they want to get out of the camp. So yes, there's a compromise to make, is give them a job, and yes. But a better way that was done was Aline, who created a company that links refugees within camps to people that want to learn languages. And the way she did is she went to see the refugees, and the refugees said, we want to be connected to the world, and we want to be seen as some of a resource that can bring something. And the best way she did it was those refugees became Arabic language teachers that connected to people in New York, in St. Petersburg, in whatever you want, teaching the world Arabic and people that wanted to learn Arabic. And that was really understanding what they wanted, to be connected to the world, not being forgotten, and also to bring to the world hope and to be seen with dignity and resource. I mean, you get it. But there's ways technology can be badly used to exploit situations if we don't do it with the overrated word of empathy.
Yeah, so the idea of hidden outcomes in technology. So with Uber, obviously Uber makes things a lot easier for me personally. I use it all the time. It's helpful. But there's a certain set of values, at least in this country, where I'm not that worried about the fact that the Uber engineers have like God mode. They can obviously track me. I don't think that they're going to use that for nefarious ends, and I don't even really think, I think most Americans don't even really think about that. But in other countries where those same rules aren't in place, they do use it to track you, or they make their own Uber in the case of China. And I think that those thoughts we need to think hard through those processes and make sure that we're not missing these like hidden outcomes of this technology that seems to make our life better on the surface, but in reality is potentially creating a serious opportunity for governments to control.
I think we have an inclination to say to ourselves, oh, I'm not bothered if somebody sees where I'm going because I'm just going to a bar or I'm just going wherever.
Nothing to hide here.
Nothing to hide here.
Yeah.
Not really quite grasping that, well, maybe that, it's, maybe this person who's on the run who's a hero is trying to hide from something. Maybe there's entire metadata that can be used for various issues. Not being able to see in a personal sense that this affects me is a huge, I think, inclination we have. And I think it's really hard for people in a popular sense to grasp the implications of a lot of technologies after large-scale deployment if they don't see it immediately affecting them. So I think that's a really important thing to talk about.
Yeah. Do you want any government, even the government you trust the most, whether it's like the Norwegian government, there's some
Or
Norwegians
even not just
here.
a government, but like a company.
Well, what I mean by that is like governments can like subpoena companies to get their access to those records. So ideally, we live in a world where that's not you can't subpoena because the company's not holding any data. You're holding your data. So that's why I'm like intrigued by this concept of decentralizing that.
So you work for Human Rights Foundation.
Yeah.
Human rights right now mean something different than it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and will mean something again different in another 10 years or 20 years. What do you sort of see as the emerging battlefields of human rights?
I think it's definitely being, again, I want to continue reiterating how the Chinese government has gone from being deathly afraid of technology 10 years ago, when most things weren't digitized, to within a decade being brilliant about it and being able to digitize their system of control. I think this is the battlefield of where human rights are going to be won or lost is in these systems.
And so you guys, refugees, human rights, medical, education. What do you guys, if technology goes in a perfect direction and all the things that you guys see as really promising and in your spaces pan out in a way we all hope they will, what will your spaces look like in several years? Let's just start and go down the line here.
It's super nice if in 10 years most refugees are feeling empowered to create technology that alleviates their own suffering. If we can empower them to do that, can you imagine the technologists behind next app or next technology are going to be people that have suffered, that have been going through really hard conditions and are just wanting this to never happen again to any other human being. I think that would be a nice place, that the refugees are empowered to create the technology.
So you hope that technology can be used to, first of all, create a level of empathy with non-refugees so they can understand better, and then also help the refugees feel, you keep coming back to feeling belonging, which is, I think, such an important part of the refugee experience that doesn't mean anything on paper. So people might think, oh, you need food, you need shelter, but the psychological aspects, I think, are probably lost on people. Are there any specific pieces of technology do you feel are actually effective at the moment right now at creating senses of community for people who are effectively nomads or effectively being moved around from camp to camp? How can technology give them a feeling of belonging and a feeling of home when they may not have a physical place that they can call home? So what are you seeing going on in that space?
It's an interesting question because I think for most of us, we are becoming very nomad and we can work from home and feel like it's work. So the idea of a place, of a home, is becoming very, very, very different. And I think even for refugees now, so it's going to be a lot of work in the mental health space.
Are you seeing that as one of the biggest problems with the refugees are facing is mental health and psychological issues? Because that's something that probably isn't getting too much attention, if so.
Yeah. I mean, basically, refugee is not an identity. It's an experience you go through, and it's the whole journey of mental health that is to be taken care of. Yeah.
And Alex, if everything goes in the best case scenario, 10 years, what do you see?
I think there's a lot of outcomes. I think one outcome is definitely this Black Mirror outcome where most governments adopt and win on adopting some sort of WeChat model where they can see everything about you and they can control everything that you do. But there is an outcome where, kind of like the idea of just being specific, owning your own currency on a private encrypted wallet that you control in the same way that you would own your money, and that years before we started to own our own communications with encrypted chat apps, that we also own our medical records, that we own our professional records, that we own our interests, that we own our opinions, and that we have this broad set of encrypted, addresses or wallets or whatever you want to call them to house what basically is our identity, and that we get to control that. I think that is an outcome, and there's this explosion of companies like Consensus and others that are building these ecosystems of apps that are possibly going to make this happen. So that would be, I think, a really positive outcome for human rights.
And how do you see this technology developing in a way that's immune to the best efforts of governments, such as the one you're talking about before, to isolate and to shut it down? Like, how does this technology be built in a way that can slip through those bubbles?
Yeah, I mean, if it's built in a way that's open and decentralized, it's obviously a lot harder for governments and companies that work with governments to control. So I think that those values, when we talk about open societies and we talk about civil society and free expression, and when we talk about independent media and we talk about independent judiciary, you can kind of think of all these things and then think about them in a microcosmic way for the I guess the coding world, the people who are building this new future. So if they can incorporate those values into these programs, I think that'll create a world that we all would really want to see here.
Alex, 10 years, where do you hope it to go? And maybe let's also, where do you fear it could go to, let's say?
So I think it's important for everyone to know here that preventable hospital error is the third leading cause of death in the US, and it's something that's not really ever talked about. We also need to know the reasons why that's happening. And really, when you understand what these care providers are going through, they do not feel empowered by any means. Their jobs are becoming more and more difficult every single day, and it's seriously unbelievable. Like, nurses no longer want to be nurses. Doctors no longer want to be doctors. They're telling their kids not to be doctors because the workload is just unbelievable. And you'd think, because we're going from fee-for-service to value-based, and those of you who don't know what that means, it's basically like the sick model is fee-for-service. So the sicker you are, the more the money the hospital makes. The value-based model is like the healthy model. The healthier you are, the more money the hospital makes. And this just happened recently. So up until this point, that's what we've been developing technology around. So with that thought in mind, it's like we need to empower the people who are providing the care to the patients and families. And the only way that's going to happen, the only way that's going to happen is with real-time transparency. Because first and foremost, patients and families have to have a voice in their care. And if they do, the sky is the limit. Because there's no one else that knows what's going on besides the patients and families. Managers have insight 10% of the time. Executives only care about their bottom line, realistically. And so the patients and families need to be the center of the healthcare system. And then at that point, we need to empower and recognize care providers. And if we do that, efficiencies will be out of this world. They'll be so much better. We'll have way high quality care compared to the way that we do now. And really, the possibilities are endless.
Eugene, same question.
So I'll just take a quick aside before talking about education specifically, say 10 years from now. And I was very happy that Josephine mentioned this because I think mental health is actually one of the most important topics for us to deal with as a society, because I think that most of us are not capable of our full potential of empathy until we fully deal with whatever issues we have internally. I know I'm someone who my entire adult life has dealt with anxiety, depression, bipolar. I've had suicidal ideation at certain points. And dealing with the part of my life that I spent not being comfortable with that was the part where I was least happy. And now where I'm like, yeah, it's me, and I know how to deal with these things, and it's just part of who I am. And it makes me able to have much healthier relationships and connect with others. So I think that before we can see any kind of behavioral change on a societal level, we have to do this individually. And still, the amount of people who, like, when I say a phrase like that, they immediately get turned off and think I'm a cuckoo person, like, that's a problem. And that, I think, resonates across social differences, cultural differences, like anything that's fear-based, I think relates to us not being able to just genuinely relate to another human being as another human being. So I think if we at least take the steps in the right direction socially, and concurrently, there's really exciting changes that are starting to happen on the tech side, where I hope to see education as much more to the ecosystem model around bringing together higher education, bringing together private, both corporate and startup, bringing together volunteers, bringing together the local government, because all these institutions in one way or another want better better education, whether it's you want a better talent pipeline, you want to have more GDP in your city, you want to just be better off. Everyone, that's a similar goal, is to have people more educated. Just we disagree on the way to make it happen as a value proposition for all of the stakeholders. So what I hope to see is to have technology leverage each other. So, to have volunteer structures. And I think Open Badges by Mozilla put out an interesting video where it was, imagine college students tutor high school students, who tutor middle school students, who tutor elementary school students. And as soon as you commit to doing this kind of tutoring over the course of a year and you complete it, that can pay down your college tuition. So there could be really innovative ways how collaborating with each other can actually be financially and emotionally beneficial for everyone. And I really think that it's a key, sort of what I hope that I imagine a lot of folks in this room are really excited about is how do we figure out some of these problems in the next 5 years? Because if we don't, then once the money floods these industries, it's going to be much tougher to weed through and find the true ideologues and not have people lost to purely, trying to find money. So that's kind of having much more tighter knit but decentralized communities, I think, can be one of a really great and powerful change in education.
And where do you fear education could go if things go bad?
Nothing changes.
You think it's like we're in the worst case scenario, I feel like.
Things can always get worse. So I'm hesitant to say that we're at rock bottom.
And you're talking about like New York State or United States.
United States of America. Yeah. I think in this country,
maybe you should say something.
And that's
What, education in France?
France or in the camps that you work in.
Yeah, I could talk for hours about that.
I just think even looking at the fact that in the States where there's 41 million people dealing with pretty serious poverty, there's such massive inequality gaps in education. And then like the school funding issue, in my opinion, has taken too much center over the last decade because it's been shown that just getting money to a school does not actually solve problems. There are a lot of other things that need to happen. So just hyper-focusing on like, oh yeah, let's get all the, some schools get 20 grand, some get 7, let's get everyone 20 and then it'll be a great world. It's not gonna work like that. There's still gonna be issues, and it makes it harder to actually innovate there. I know like Camden's a really interesting example in New Jersey.
Well, I was just gonna ask a quick question. So unlike 20 years ago, you theoretically could learn anything that is available to learn on your own with a computer.
Yep.
What does that do for you? Like where do you see people not taking that opportunity of that, other than when I don't do it, it's just me being lazy? Like
I think that's it. I think it's just laziness and pleasure seeking trumps me wanting to truly advance my life over the course of the next decade. A lot of
basic and medium courses at Harvard and MIT or whatever you can take.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, so you said what's stopping someone from making... You asked what's stopping someone from making use of the basically infinite amount of resources that are now available online for free or for whatever the cost of internet connection. So I have a younger brother. He goes to a public high school, and just partially he has to. It's kind of the law. If he doesn't go to high school, then I think he gets taken away from my parents. So I try to tell him, hey, like, go online, like, learn programming, man, like, check out Solidity, do the Crypto Zombies tutorial, like, read something, do anything. He's like, nah, man, I got school. And I'm like, what do you do at school? He's like, nothing. He sits in class and he's on his phone because the teachers aren't engaging him. The public school system is failing him, but he's being forced to take part in it. Yeah. So that's one of the things, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and there's someone behind you with a question.
Yeah, that's that.
So my wife actually built programs for New York City to teach entrepreneurship, and some of the students there, they learned to code over the phone, calling a mentor to talk through like the code set, so close the hashtag here, and the reason was that there is not actually access in New York City itself, let alone in most of the United States, to the internet. And that's kind of a base level for this question about how do you take advantage of these resources. The truth is the world is not equal in the access at all, and it's kind of a mythology that there's open access.
You mean like the computers at the school weren't connected to the internet?
There were no computers in the school. In a New York City public school, the library capped access at 1 hour.
Okay.
And there's also the social aspect of education. I think it's important to go back to. You don't learn because you read and you get like the content. The medium is the message. So if the medium is interactive, that's when you learn. You learn with people. You learn by iteration. And if you're coding, you know that. So you learn by practice. And so, yes, we can create as many MOOCs as possible online, but if you can't interact with it because the UX is shit, then, yes, the content is there, but I don't learn from it because the US is shit.
I mean, for since time immemorial, we've had Encyclopedia Britannica, which in theory has a lot of information, but the UX in Britannica sucks. Like UX in a giant 20-volume book sucks. Just because it's there doesn't mean it's easy to use. And with the internet, I think clearly another problem pops up, which is the signal-to-noise ratio. It's about finding high-quality information. It's about the ability for people with various ideas to infiltrate the conversation with falsities and to distract and to change things. And even if you're online and in one window you've got here's the the great works of Shakespeare or something important, and the other you've got Candy Crush Saga, which is going to win. And it's having access clearly doesn't and isn't the be all end all. It is about presenting it in ways that are trustworthy, that have trust behind them and are fun. Clearly.
Yeah. Fun is the one element where you learn the most. I mean, technology, human conditions. You have the human conditions here, and the technology is a tool, right? If you're not aware of your own human condition and how you want to better it, how are you going to better it, right? It's an interaction. I mean, technology.
I can give like an aside as to one area where technology is having like an just unambiguously good role, and I did a little bit of a segment on this on the BBC. They have like a digital human series. So the host was started by asking her grandmother, who was alive in World War II in Poland, and she was talking about how powerful the radio was. She could hear these outside messages from the outside world. My organization, one of the things we do is smuggle flash drives into North Korea with books and content from the outside world. And it is amazing because the North Korean government, I mean, this is very newsy right now, but any sort of aid or food or anything that you send to the North Korean government, they're going to manipulate and take advantage of. But they can't take advantage of the technology that you send in because it's truth, it's outside culture. So what are they going to do? They could burn it, but what ends up happening is even the people inside the regime start trading it. So I think in the it's ironic that in the darkest corner of the world, technology is like unambiguously playing a positive role.
It's about creating virality around truth and about education, about health. So, I want to make sure that the floor is opened up for a couple minutes here. So, if you guys have any thoughts, anything you want to say, just throw your hand up or throw your voice up. Just be heard. Come on, Beal. No, but every guy, come on. Yeah, you.
The focus seems to be on big cities. How about rural parts of the world?
I'm happy to speak to that, at least in the context of the U.S. I know, so I've spent most of my life in New York City. I currently am in Pittsburgh, and my hope is to continue my career focusing towards the Midwest. I think that and Pittsburgh has an interesting problem that between UPitt and Carnegie Mellon there's literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of students that come in every year, but 99.999% want to go to either San Francisco, New York, or D.C. And that creates a problem. And I remember just after the last election when, I was living in Brooklyn at the time, people were acting like the world was over. And what really bothered me about it was that people were saying these things, but then it's like, oh, well, why, you're clearly in a bubble here. 90% of New York City voted for Hillary. Let's go to places where people don't think like us and talk to them and try to get them to think our way. So I think that there's so many issues around getting a lot of this to all individuals. And I mean, there's also geographic issues. I know just on the education side, like I recently did a report on the state of transportation and education and like how they might be getting ready for the future of autonomous vehicles in education. Like there's areas that are using 30-year-old buses that travel they'll go out of their way 45 minutes each way for one student. And then other students have to wake up 2 hours before school. So it's all of these just different confluence of issues between the geography, the lack of full internet everywhere, the fact that a lot of these MOOCs and resources aren't fully available for individuals yet. So my hope is that more young entrepreneurs don't want to stay on the coast and want to start moving inland.
If we're dealing with education, I'm going to make a guess that the lowest hanging fruit you have to improve the school experience and the outcome is sleep and food. And there's probably a lot of fields in which that's the case. Those are human needs that a lot of people are deprived of. particularly in schools, particularly in rural schools, when you have extremely long bus routes, when you have kids who may be hungry 2/3 of the day or the entire day, which creates all sorts of problems that we're not going to go into right now. And you think about like, oh, what has Uber done with logistics or Lyft done with like logistics? How could that be applied to bus routing? And you think there's probably a lot of opportunities for these people to kind of get together and solve these problems that just haven't happened yet.
I also think it's an element of priorities. Like I know over this last summer, I had a family friend visiting from Ukraine, and he's 13, 14. I forgot if he was ending middle school or starting high school. But same overall issues, busing, etc. School isn't always the best, but like national priority. Everyone has literally a home-cooked meal 3 times at school. They have someone cooking on premise, making like all of these very traditional Slavic dishes, which is very amusing for me. But like, it's awesome. The idea of going to school and getting a home-cooked meal, that's unheard of in this country.
People would be excited to go to school.
Yeah, but in like a country like Ukraine, which has a lot of other issues to deal with, that would be an easy part of the budget to cut. They don't, right? It's social priorities of how we care about each other. And for me, that comes back to the mental health and the empathy. And like, until we all really care about each other, the dial is going to be moving too slowly.
And I think one of the problems we have in the States is that we don't have too many shared big issues across the entire country. What is a big issue to New York is not a big issue to some other places. And so creating, these like things that are sacred cows that we're always going to cater to becomes very, very difficult in the US because it's so big and messy and diverse, I feel like.
I think there is an opportunity to rally people from all different political ideologies around the issue of privacy. And I think we're in a moment where we can still have that. I mean, raise your hand if you actually think that privacy is important. So pretty much everybody here? I mean, in some cultures, and I'm not trying to be, it's not the people's choice. Governments have basically over decades created a system where people would, in a free and fair election, not vote for privacy. They'd rather vote for stability. Like this whole war on terror argument we have in the United States. I believe, my guess would be if you polled like 8 out of 10 mainland Chinese, they would all vote for stability. It's just basically what my mainland Chinese friends tell me. And that's like a tragedy for me. So I think privacy is something that all Americans could get around and fight for. And that's what's going to be very interesting to watch in this particular space that you all are building, is the ability to create technology that protects our privacy. And I think I can convince people from both major political parties here that that's like an important thing. So I think maybe we can rally around that.
I'm into that. Anybody else? Come on. Yeah, what's up?
Do you guys think you can do true sort of educational credentialing online right now, or that's reliable and trusted, or do you think that requires like physical testing space still? And how do you see the future?
Have you seen e-badging like running around? It doesn't work for refugees yet, and people are trying to experiment. I don't know much more. But what you're pointing out is the issue of trust and how we're trying to, with technology and blockchain, recreate that trust. And on one side, I am torn because at the end of the day, whatever is on the blockchain is being put by a human. So the human can still fail. So it will need to come from an authority position to impose a system that is trustworthy, as with anything human. That's my answer.
But is there a way to, like, could you? Oh, sorry. I was just gonna ask if you could. Can software like test you basically, and without any humans, like make a decision that you are potentially qualified, and then lock that in, and then where are we on that? Like from an educational point of view, like let's say your ability to speak Russian, and like you could go up and.
I mean, I think in terms of what's already, I don't think that's truly happening. I mean, I think that there's attempts at it here within consensus. I think also identity is a big thing that's stopping credentialing. So between Uport, between Factum, between other consensus startups to plug it up while we're in the lounge. But I think there are a lot of potential things that can happen here. But I totally agree with the fact that there's a limitation both from the actual tech side, but also the institutions that want to collaborate around it aren't always the ones that want to put forth the resources to make it happen. And like, how am I going to make money by helping, some underprivileged student get jobs better. Like, what am I going to do? Like, have them as an investment? That raises crazy ethical issues. So I'm very bullish on the idea of educational certification. I'm actually trying to work with a few groups, and I want to talk to you about that as well, but to try to like think of best practices and standards around that. But I still think we're a ways off of this being a truly open system for anyone to use. I hope that there will be more like private implementations.
Do you think in
for
50 years people will look back and think it was completely insane to spend $250,000 to send their kids to a liberal arts college for 4 years?
As someone who's, while in grad school, still paying off undergrad, yeah, it's insane. Not worth the money, people. As I pay for more.
You wonder?
Yeah. So on the just quickly jumping on the topic of credentialing and authority. You think about credentials, educational credentials, they're there because you have an academic authority that says like, and we all trust that academic authority. So one of the ways we've looked at it with blockchain is not about necessarily replacing that authority with another authority or actually doing credentialing, but making the group, the community, that authority. So empowering the community. So if you have 6,000 doctors saying like, we set up this test that proves that someone is a doctor and this person passed this test, they're probably a qualified doctor, as opposed to saying like, oh yeah, like this person graduated from Syracuse Medical School, they're now a doctor. And you alleviate the need for a single central source of authority, and potentially that opens up an opportunity for us to disseminate more credentials.
The AMA is going to hate that.
And with IoT, there's so much more
You can
data.
probably also create incentive structures to make sure that people are rewarded for reporting accurate credentialing, right?
Is there a organization or a company doing that?
Go look at Fathom. I'll show you. It's on the board downstairs.
So in terms of credentialing, let's say someone creates this new system for credentials. How do you get people to actually trust it? Because like you create this new system, you bring me this person, say, yeah, I have credited as a doctor on the blockchain. Why? Like, what's going to get me to trust this person versus a traditional medicine?
The trust is coming from the collective, from the group, right? It's not coming from one individual, if I understand well.
Right. Well, he's saying a collective group of people, in this case, doctors, are credentialing someone.
Right.
But then, how did the patients aren't taking part of that process? They might not understand that process. They might not see the process. How do you get people to trust that this new system that's wildly different from what we
You
have
build
now,
it with them. You build that thing with the patient.
That's
You don't do
critical.
it without, because you will never be able to understand what they really need if you don't work with them. It's the same with refugees. It's like, don't build technology without them.
And this
Have them involved in
yeah.
the building of the technology.
And it clearly isn't an easy thing to do, especially because the relationship between professional credentialing groups, whether it's hairstylists or doctors, and the law is long and windy and weird and deals with every municipality you can ever imagine, where in some states it's against the law to cut your hair without a license, right? Much less perform surgery. And so you're dealing, and the forces, the entrenched forces that benefit or believe in the existing structure, I'm not going to say they're clearly believing it just for financial reasons, may believe it's the best way of doing things, there's going to be massive resistance. So this is clear, especially when you're doing something like medicine, which is going to be much harder to make that change with than hairstyling, which has laws in place in a lot of states preventing unlicensed people from cutting hair, right? So imagine for doctors, this is clearly a long-term, very difficult problem to solve.
I'm really glad you brought up hairstyling. Got a question for you. There's
Thank you.
This is the most epic conversation about credentialing.
It's a fascinating topic, though.
Talk about something brilliant. There's millions of accredited hairstylists in the world. Would you be willing to go to any of them to cut your hair?
Well, I don't care, so sure. No, you're asking to ask somebody else.
I think the healthcare topic is really, really interesting, and you touched on an incredible point. So in this model, the best way to do it is to align the incentives, because right now, everybody's worried about their bottom line. If you can make the system an easier way to get into the system, the cost is going to go down. If the cost goes down, everybody wins, because now the supply is increased. So if we're making it easier for people to become doctors...
Everybody but the people who were suppliers when there's limited supply.
Yes, but it's still value then increases, because now there's more of a supply, so there's more of a competitive market where the value increases, so people are better at doing their job, and therefore patients get better quicker. And if patients are getting better quicker, the fees go down too, because they're not spending as much to be sick for long periods of time.
The only thing, so credentials aren't about education, they're about control. To your point about hairstylists, historically the reason for those laws was about controlling minority populations because you had to train on white hair, straight hair, and therefore it's very difficult for someone who trained on natural hair to get a license. So it was actually used for population control. It was similar with like you go to doctors and so on. All of the historical background behind it has never really had much to do with knowledge. And so that's the kind of the question with
Right.
blockchain.
So can we get there? And I think we're moving from a time when like right now it's like the Texas State Board of whatever, medicine or education, you have to pass their test to become a whatever. In 10, 20 years, it's going to be this, potentially one outcome is this community-driven thing where it could potentially be, more meritocratic. And I think we had a question back there.
So I work for an agency in New York that builds technology with founders, middle markets, and I was wondering, there's X amount of money being invested in technology every year, and I was wondering, what are your thoughts on having an outside advocate doing diligence around ethical standards around technology being built? Is that happening? Is there any movement in the space? What do you see the future in that space being?
You should check out the Center for Humane Technology. A few of my friends launched this. It's basically started with the time well spent movement, which was telling people like me to stop looking at their smartphones because it's like hurting our lives basically. But now they're branching out to look at like the effects that obviously social media are, the doors they're opening for government propaganda and for other different campaigns to hurt our democracy. They're also looking at, potential like pro and con of what's happening with large AI systems. So there are like independent organizations that are now being formed to address this. But I don't like Google has ethicists that work for them. I don't know what that job is like, but
The reason I'm asking is because a large portion of San Francisco and New York are building technology every day. We're
Yeah.
looking at pie. We're not looking at the sliver in which
Right.
it has a huge effect, right? If we don't think about that tiny 2% sliver or those use cases.
Right.
And that's happening every day, over and over again. I feel like there's definitely
I know another area where that's being looked at, so I could speak to, at Carnegie Mellon, the head of our philosophy department there, a guy by the name of David Danks, the area of his research specifically, he pretty much heads a team, I forget if it's 30 or 40 people, but he heads a team that everyone on the team is looking on the effects of automation and societal impacts of fill in the blank. So his personal research is the automation of weaponry, which, what happens when there's just weapon-connected drones hovering across all of us, right? So his research is very scary to think of, but a lot of other people in the department, whether it's purely AI or a lot of these other elements of technology, I think there's more coming up around that. And I guess to kind of link it to the previous question, in terms of kind of decentralizing and being able to do that, I think the universities, private agencies, think tanks, they have to come together and keep each other in check because that is what can help with overall trust. And I think when building a decentralized system, I'm just speaking about educational credentialing because that's just where I'm coming from. But in that world, if you're just doing it with a bunch of no-name organizations or the UN or HRF or Carnegie Mellon or MIT join, all of a sudden it's very different. So a lot of the time the low-hanging fruit is sell it to one person that has a reputable name brand behind you that can kind of help give a little bit of that credibility, and that could already, it does wonders in terms of people feeling comfortable with that organization.
So we got to wrap this up. This has been an awesome talk. One thing I want to say before we go, though, is we really could have a whole panel about the history of credentialism because it's fascinating, but something that just occurred to me, and I didn't make this connection when I said it, is that one of the reasons the AMA and modern credentials exists for doctors is because people who used to administer surgery were barbers. And historically speaking, you get your hair cut and you get your appendix removed. I don't know. But, and there was obviously a real need to put this in the hands of people who, we trust and everything else. And I think right now we're at a really interesting place because that model solved a problem that existed around the turn of the century. And now we're at the turn of another century and there's new problems that arise. And maybe it is time for a new model to look at. So that's your kind of takeaway thought. I want to give it all up for every single one of these folks here because they are incredible. As well as Consensus. Please have a great South by and enjoy all the swag that's to be found throughout town this week. Everybody have a wonderful time.